Now, by far the hardest thing about getting this plugin to work is that Maven is going to have to communicate with Docker. And you know by now that Docker is running as a daemon process, either on your native machine or possibly in a virtual machine. If you're running on Windows or Macintosh, then you will have a virtual machine running in the background. Maven will communicate with the Docker daemon process by using some kind of a network connection. And sometimes this network connection needs to be configured. Now, I'm recording here on Docker for Windows, not the Docker toolbox. And for me, I've discovered that I don't need any configuration of the Docker host, which is why, for me, I've commented out these 3 lines. For me, it will just work. So definitely, if you're running on Docker for Windows, then you can just do what I've done here. You could, in fact, delete these 3 lines of code. However, on different platforms, you do need a configuration. On some platforms, you will have to explicitly have a Docker host line pointing to HTTP, and this is localhost :2375, which is the Docker daemon port. Now, I have that line in when I'm developing on my laptop, which is running the Mint Linux distribution, but I don't need it for Docker for Windows. But on some platforms, such as Mac OS, you may need this line here instead. This is a Unix socket, and I don't understand the full reasons why, but when I'm working on an Amazon Linux machine, then I do need this line of configuration. Now, later on in the course, we will be using an Amazon Linux machine, but we won't actually be building there. So that would be significant if, for example, you're running a Jenkins installation on an Amazon Linux box and you want to run your Maven builds from that box. So I'm sort of a little bit nervous here that clearly there's a lot of different configurations depending on your platform, and I can't test them all on the video. So I suggest you just try running this with all of these lines commented out. If you have any problems, then try the localhost version. Try the socket version definitely if you're on a Linux distribution or a Macintosh. If you do get completely stuck, as I said at the start, don't panic. You don't need to do this for the rest of the course. You can do the building of the images by hand, so it's not a disaster, but it would be nice if you could get up and running. So just to reiterate, I'm on a Docker for Windows, so I don't need any of these configurations. Now, the next block that I've given you is if you want to do pushes to Docker Hub as part of your build process. Now, obviously, Maven is going to need to log into Docker Hub to do that. So one way of doing that is by providing this auth config block where you put in your username and password. Now, this is a very easy way of getting up and running and making things work. However, I guess you would prefer to store your username and password somewhere outside of your Maven configuration. So I'll show you in a few moments how you can do that. For now, we'll just leave that as is. Now we're in the images block, and this is where we can naturally configure the images that we're going to be building. Now, we only have one image tag in here. This line here is where you specify the name of the image that you're building. I deliberately put that in as a placeholder to force you to rename it. So for me, it's virtual pair programmers /fleetman-web app. Now, if you're publishing your image to your own Docker Hub repository, then of course you'll need to change this virtual pair programmers to something different. And if you're not planning on pushing these images to Docker Hub, then you could remove the whole of the label as well. That's entirely up to you. Now, that's pretty much it, apart from this very important line here, the Docker file directory. Now, this is telling the Maven plugin where to find the Docker file. Up until now on this course, we've been storing the Docker file in the root of the project. But you'll notice from here that I'm now proposing that we store the Docker file in a subfolder, such as src main docker. Now, the reason for this is something that I've been ignoring up until now. I'm here in the root of the project, and of course, In the root of the project, we've got a lot of subfolders and a lot of configuration files, and basically we have a lot of assets inside this folder. You've probably noticed that whenever you run a build, I'm going to sort of slow down the video at this stage just so you catch what's happening there. Every time we've been building an image, you've seen this sending build context to Docker daemon. And I don't think I've explained what's happening there at any point. Well, Docker is running as a daemon process on your machine. And in order for it to do its work, your command line has to send all of the information, all the data that Docker's going to need to build an image. And the way it works actually is via this dot here. I can finally explain what the dot's all about. It's telling Maven that it will find the Docker file in this folder, and this folder and all of its subdirectories contains all of the data that Docker's going to need in order to build its image. So what the Docker command line is doing is zipping up this entire folder and all subfolders, and when it zips it up, it sends it across to the Docker daemon through a network connection. Now, I've been putting the Docker file in the root folder really just out of laziness, but it's pretty inefficient because every time we run that image build, it has to zip everything up and do that very expensive network transfer. Now, if you think about it, all our image build needs is the Docker file and the jar file that we're building. So we really should now be more efficient in the way that we're running these builds. It's actually not too bad right now. My project directory is about 65 megabytes. But of course, on a real project, this is likely to be significantly bigger, and it could slow down your builds quite a lot. So for that reason, and if you're following along with me, you will need to do the same. We're going to create a new folder inside the src folder under main, a new folder called Docker. And I'm proposing that we will take the existing Docker file and move it into that new Docker folder. And the purpose of that is now when we run the image build, and of course we're going to be doing that now through Maven, it's only going to have to zip up the contents of this Docker folder, which is just actually the Docker file. Well, of course, we also need the jar file as well, but this plugin can handle that. If I go back to the POM, it's actually is quite obscure tag here, this descriptor ref artifact. The plugin knows to take the jar file from the target directory, and because of this, it knows to transparently include the jar file alongside the Docker file. Now, it doesn't physically move it into this Docker folder. You won't see any changes to that Docker folder, but conceptually, that's what it's doing. So it will make the whole build process be much more efficient. There is one change you will need to make to your Docker file, however. We just have to change this one line here, where up until now we've been copying the jar file from the target directory into the image. Now, it's just the way that this plugin works that instead of working from the target directory, it will now work from a directory called Maven. You should now be able to include Docker into your build process. Now, we'll improve this in a few moments, but just to test everything's working, we'll right-click on the pom.xml and a run as Maven build. And the goals we're going to run are the clean goal, which as usual is going to clean the target directory. Then we're going to run the package goal, which will build your jar file, and that's what we've been doing so far on the course. Now we're going to add an additional step, which is docker : build, and that's going to build a Docker image from the Docker file. Hope that makes sense. Let's see if it works. And now there's a very significant step. Once the jar file's been created, you can now see some logging coming from Docker. And you'll recognize all of this. This is exactly what you will have seen on the command line. And don't forget, if you have any problems at this stage, it's probably due to the Docker host. Check out your configuration there. But according to this, it's now successfully built an image which has been tagged virtual pair programmers /Fleetman web app. Now, I just want to be clear that although we've done this through Maven, we are still talking to the same Docker daemon process that we've been using throughout the course. So therefore, if I go to my command line and do a Docker image ls, I've got a lot of irrelevant images here from earlier rehearsals, but the important one is the one at the top here, Fleetman web app, which was created apparently 52 seconds ago. So that's the one that was just created. So we're not doing anything clever or special here through Maven. We're just making everything a little more seamless than it was before. I could now, on this command line, run that image in exactly the same way. By the way, you can also run your images using Maven. If you're interested in doing that, just check out the reference manual. That's not something that I generally do, and the reasons for that will become obvious when we do probably the next chapter on Docker Compose. That's how I generally run my images.